So, Chris, what have you been searching in the job opening category?
All right, so let me start with the cliche, which is something in the forestry industry, something like that, because of course that's like the less realistic one. Because as soon as you start researching it, you realize the bar to entry is terrible, barrier to entry is a nightmare. The shameless materialist in me is actually thinking about real estate because there's a girl in Florida who I know who's into real estate, and there might be a sublimated crush happening there. I can't tell if I'm actually interested in it or if this is just me exploring that sublimated crush. And then let's see, the ideal scenario is probably going to be something like I found an article 2 days ago where you can teach in Nigeria, teaching English, getting 60K a year, but you're only going to have to live on like 20. And it would get me out of the administrative nest of vipers that I'm in right now. Totally fresh new scene. So that's out there as a possible option as well. We'll see.
I always ask
That's an
that
exciting
question, and
thing.
you always have different answers. I love it.
Always different. My
Um,
answer is always different whenever you ask me that.
welcome everybody. We're logging in for another episode of our Wild Roof Journal podcast. Today, two guests. One has been published in Wild Roof Journal. One is soon to be published. So just get a quick intro. You could say who you are, and why you're here, and then we'll dig into just a couple of kind of like writerly, what to do when this happens kind of questions, and see where it goes. Eben, you've been around the Wild Roof block a couple of times. You've been on a podcast before. You've been in the issues. So I'll let you go first.
Nice to be back with Wild Roof community. I'm Eben Bein. He or they pronouns are great. I am calling in from Nipmuc land, also called Littleton, Massachusetts, close to where I grew up, in a house where this weekend I actually spent time with the Chickadee Collective, which is a little group of poets that I hang out with this weekend, editing and workshopping. And I'm here happy to be with the publication that has celebrated my work the most times of any other place that I've submitted, and so it's really special to be back.
Awesome. Sounds great. And Morgan.
Hi. So I am Morgan Stevens. I am here in Washington, D.C., and this is the first time I'll be appearing in Wild Roof Journal, and I'm very excited. This is also my first poetry collection. I come from journalism background, and poetry was one of those things that I just kind of held in my heart, I think, and did outside of what I did professionally. And things change, and I'm thrilled to be able to share one of the poems in my debut collection with Wild Roof Journal. This is actually the first poem that is being published, so it's a big deal for me, and I'm just so excited. It's such a personal collection, and yeah, just happy to be here and share kind of the process of that.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah. So, always the first publication is always a little special. I don't know if you can get around it. It just is. That's one of the things when this kind of aligns with the two of you. One of the things that came to mind with something we could talk about, just like, okay, how does this happen? Well, you're right. Okay, you think it's good. Some days you look back at it again, you think it's terrible. Which one is, which one's true? Is it good? Is it great? Is it the best thing ever? Is it the worst thing ever? So just that kind of process and the ups and downs of the writing experience is something that is just kind of interesting, because I think almost everybody, I think it's safe to say, kind of shares it to some extent. first things first, like, how did you come to it? So yeah, Morgan, you said it's kind of always something you carried with you a little bit, to some extent, even if you weren't doing it all along. But just once you decide, okay, I'm gonna like start writing something down, whether it's in a notebook or on a file, how does that creation, I mean, you ended up with a chapbook. How does that like unfold as far as like once you get rolling, how did it look for you? So yeah, you can, whoever wants to take a stab at that one first.
I'll take a stab at it. It was weird because, you know, poetry was kind of, or at least this collection was something that had to happen when nothing else could. I was in a place of physical decline, cognitive decline. The collection is about me and chronic illness, specifically long COVID. And, that is an illness that took me out of this very straight and narrow path and set me in my house every day. I knew I needed to write down the experience. And initially, I had actually started with a memoir, and I realized soon that, not to say that I won't, eventually write a memoir, but it was less visceral and it was more technical, and I wanted just to get to the heart of the matter. And I found that I would wake up in the morning and even just sitting with my phone, typing out on my, like, what is it? My notes on my iPhone, that little app that we all have. I would type out poems there. And a lot of the poems, ended up staying in the collection, those first ones that it was almost like this catharsis. And I'm sure a lot of writers can connect with that, I suppose, this kind of like purging of just needing to get out what I had seen and what I was feeling. And a lot of the times it was surreal. So I needed to put that on pen and paper, so to speak. And so that's kind of how it started.
Oh, I love Morgan, this idea. As somebody who is more of a prose writer too, I also did a sort of journalism school of sorts, and I was a teacher, a science teacher, but was like sort of in prose land, and then needed the flexibility and challenge and freshness of poetry to bring new words and new orders and new rests into my sentences, to sort of match and understand some of what was emotionally going on, and to create something from that also feels really powerful. I think about artists that have really changed my life, that from the way that they process sad things. I'm thinking about, Joni Mitchell, or Sharon Olds, people who there's something about this moving in and through the most painful things, to find the beauty in them is so, this has been so precious for me in my own healing, and something that I sort of am after. In terms of when I sort of came to poetry, though, it was somewhat earlier, not as a writer, but as a reader, in ninth grade. And there was a big poetry project, and my mom was a big part of bringing me to poetry, her and I exchanging poems, which later, when I read my piece in Wild Roof, you guys might get a glimpse of that.
Totally, totally off the cuff, but do you have a hot take on, since you mentioned Joni Mitchell, do you have an opinion on Randy Newman?
I'm not familiar enough to have an opinion. I'm sorry.
Okay, fair enough. I would pick him if I had to pick the musician who writes lyrics that are good enough to be poetry, that like attacked me as not even, I was probably in seventh grade, just like knitting needle into the heart, like, oh, someone is expressing everything I'm feeling. I would put him in the top two of those. And yeah, I was starting to get into music and to get into poetry, and he seemed like everybody's talking about Bob Dylan, was like, he's my sweet spot.
I've Send me some song recs, Chris, because I would love to, but I haven't explored yet.
There's two or three that might you might be like, oh, this is like corny New Orleans bluesy stuff, or they may destroy you from the inside. So it could go either way.
Yeah, it sounds like poetry, right? It's like, yeah, this is just kind of like it's there. It's easy to dismiss, but when it does hit you, it has an impact. Yeah, I wrote down catharsis, purging, get it out. So there's this kind of theme, which I think, yeah, I mean, it's a real thing that a lot of people share is like, we write because we need to. It's not like, what am I going to do today? Like, let's set up like some options. Sometimes it just happens because we have to do it for whatever the circumstances.
I'm sorry, on that thread really quick. I think a shift that has happened for me in the last year, I'm now 3 years into like sort of taking poetry pretty seriously. So it's relatively fresh for me, but I think early on in my writing, I sort of rolled my eyes whenever artists or poets would be like, oh yes, well, the poem has its own agenda and is like its own beast. And I used to be very grumpy about that and very like, stop with this woo woo. There's craft in every art. I want to find my way in. And now the pendulum has swung. And like what you were saying about catharsis, this sort of like, I need to learn from my poems. I need to learn from whatever those beings are that are on the other side of the ethereal boundary that poke their heads through in the form of a poem. And I need to know what they have to teach me. So I've, anyway, it's like the catharsis, both what comes out of me, but also this sort of like the universe enters into poetry writing to offer us things. And I think I have a very different layer of respect and need for what the world has to teach me.
Yeah, that's fascinating when that happens, isn't it? When like, yeah, you write something and then you have to kind of deal with what you wrote in this kind of weird, like there's a little bit of distance between the person who wrote it and the person who's like then now dealing with it and trying to make it into something cohesive or coherent or whatever.
And I'm curious if you're coming from a journalistic background, is there either a tension or a mutual reinforcement between the style of writing, where if you're being journalistic, you're supposed to be objective, you're trying to be as literal and concrete as possible with information and how you communicate it, and then with poetry, where you might be getting something out of yourself that, again, could be from like the ethereal plane or subconscious or actual kind of spiritual energy. How do you kind of think about that in your own writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I definitely separate the two, but I think there's a little bit, people have this idea about journalism that it's very objective and non-biased, but we pick which stories we want to tell. And we have a worldview because we're human beings. And yes, there are facts. Of course, there's facts, and you can't debate whether, it rained today or not. But we have a perspective. I think one of the best journalists, in my opinion, was Hunter S. Thompson, and he had a perspective on the world, but there was truth in his writing, but because of his perspective. So I think I brought that into the process, but I do recognize too that, especially with a lot of the kind of confessional poems that I have in this collection, I use I a lot. It's rare unless you're, writing an op-ed or speaking about yourself, especially in things that aren't as flattering, is kind of frowned upon in media. We have these kind of steel armors of I'm impenetrable and I need to be looked at as a reliable source. And poetry is the opposite of that. And I think that's what I absolutely love about it, because there is like such a truth. Ironically, there is a truth in poetry that you may not get from journalism because of its veneer of objectivity. It's just a different type of truth. It may be, I'm not saying it's not a factual truth. There's things that I write about, in the poem that's being published in Wild Roof Journal that, Aaron knows there's facts there. There's things that have happened that I write about, and I'm sure you guys do as well. But it's from what I saw and how I perceived it. So, and how it's affected me. I think you speaking on the subconscious, like, that's really fascinating to me, because I've kind of learned, and as I'm sure you guys might know too, like, the more you write, the more you kind of get to know yourself and what you really feel and how you think about things in ways that you didn't recognize before because you didn't have to. And when you're writing things, you're like, the poem that I wrote, it's about my mother and the way that, things might have affected me as a child. Did I think of that before it wasn't something I thought about as much, but it was ingrained in me subconsciously. And so I guess that's kind of a long-winded answer to, yeah, it's different, and it's risky. I'm not going to say that it's not risky, because I'm still a journalist, but I think going through the illness that I went through, I hate to say this, but frankly, I don't really care. I am going to be true to my work and what I've seen and what I've experienced, because life is too short not to.
Would never have been able to guess whether or not Hunter S. Thompson would still be involved, because put Randy Newman top 3 music, I'd put Hunter S. Thompson top 3 writer heroes of all time. So that's awesome to hear. My dad I turned 11. He's like, there's a difference between actual truth, emotional truth, and the literature can get you the emotional truth. Oh, okay, Dad. And the last 30 years have been kind of adding nuance onto that kind of basic setup, that they're both true, but there's going to be a lot of intertwined, complex ambiguity and paradoxical stuff happening.
That's really fascinating. So yeah, I guess now's probably a good time to share a little, like, our exchange. Me and I've had an exchange on email, and it was like 9 p.m. at night. I was just being kind of like sloppy with my word choices. And my question was something, because I was like sharing what we can talk about. Something like, well, how do you get objectivity when you're writing? Like, how do you get an objective sense of, like, if it's doing what you want to do, if it's communicating what you want to communicate? And I think I hope I'm getting your sentiment right. It's like, I'm not sure I like that word or something like that. But yeah, I think ultimately we are on the same page, because I didn't mean objectivity. I meant something like, how do you get, like, a useful insight into your writing, and something to reveal what you really meant, or what you can gain from it and what you can learn from it. And that's, of course, different than, like, objectivity, like you were saying, in a more kind of, like, strict sense. So yeah, like, it's kind of a weird, messy process, because you're bouncing it off, if it's somebody else, or if it's just your future self, like, later on down the road or something. How do you get, like, a useful insight into, like, this thing you poured out, when you're looking to tighten it up and make it into something that can be a publishable piece, if that makes sense as a question.
Morgan, you want to kick this one off? No,
Sure.
Like, yeah.
How do I tighten my work up? God, what do they say? Killing your darlings. Well, it's tough, because I don't know. Like, sometimes I feel like if you get rid of too much, you get rid of what you actually wanted on the page. But then at the same time, I feel like sometimes you really need to make it more concise, or choose a different word, or take that line out that just didn't stick out to you and just was kind of there, but keep that favorite word and think about, why is that? Or say that a line sticks out to you and you're like, at least this is what I try to do, is, why does this line stick out to me so much? Like, what do I love about this line? And why does it just capture me? And, if it's not a line like that, I try to really look at it and see if I need it or not. But then at the same time, this is not an easy process, because you're looking it's hard to go from like I'm looking at the wholeness of a poem to narrowing it down to the technical line or even word of it. And that is a really tough thing to do, especially with your own work, I think, because we're looking at it through a different lens than a reader who is not the one who has written it. So I don't think there's any easy answer or one answer to this. It's kind of just cut through the brush as much as you can and hope that you keep what you meant to start out with. And if you haven't, you can always go back. You can always go, like I always save my first drafts and all of that part of the process, because if I'm looking at a poem and it's just not what I thought it was at the beginning, or I'm not as happy with it, I will kind of look at the earlier versions and see if I've cut out something that, oh, maybe that's interesting. Maybe I should kind of expand on that. So.
Oh, yeah, Morgan, thank you for putting words to that. I think like, I love how
it's a
you
tough question.
Yeah, no, it's so good. And I love how you sort of started with the like kill your darlings, which I think is something that we've heard before, and also has a sort of like violence and a little bit less nuance than I think we actually mean when like doing a writing process. Like I just this weekend, I actually said to like some of my other poets, I feel like this weekend there's some more times that I sort of asked my darlings if they wanted to step aside, so that like to be like, I want to know, like I want to sort of imagine them having agency to teach me about whether they are necessary or not. And actually to trust that a lot of the times if I ask, and for me, the asking is let me remove it and see how it reads, is then like, oh yeah, no, it doesn't need to be here. Or it makes itself known. And it's like, wait a minute, no, this is necessary. And so yeah, I think I understand why we use that sort of brutal language. And I think it's because when we have, or for me, when I develop personal attachment to a piece, there's a sort of violence that I need to commit towards myself in order to move the piece on through time. But if I'm in a dance with the piece and it feels more like pruning or more like gardening or some more of a dance, then it sort of reduces that sense of violence. Another thing that you and Aaron, this is also connected to what you were saying about believability, what makes a poem believable. When Morgan was sharing how important it was for her to get vulnerable and to just sort of say what was going on in her life, to me, that's such a part of emotional believability of like, regardless of factual objectivity, that the part of bearing the soul and really showing yourself being ugly, to like showing yourself as three-dimensional, like makes us a speaker into a flawed human. I think all of us have seen those poems that are polished, that that polish away the speaker's flaws, not just the poem's flaws, until it becomes sterile. I know I've done that to some of my own poems. I think that sometimes that thing that I have to go back and hunt for my early drafts is a part where the lump was really in my throat, or my voice cracked in some way while writing.
Yeah, there's so much there, so much good stuff. Do you find is it a combination of like just rereading it through time and then also getting like, a trusted person to give you a little bit of like course correction?
Thank you for
So
asking.
yeah, it's got to be, I think the answer is both, right?
Yeah, and like to that latter point, I think just like Morgan was saying about we can't ever really know what the reader is like. Like, yes, I read over often, but to me, another critical part of building believability is testing it out on other people. And that means community, that means community through time. And that's hard because some parts of writing are so preciously solo and need to be. It's like this combination where you need the solitude to come into a deep relationship with yourself and what your words are saying, and this beautiful moment to test and ask, is this doing what I think it's doing? And like sometimes that's nice to do in a one-on-one, but for me, the progression is usually a one-on-one, and then it's in a group where I can hear multiple voices disagree about parts of my poem. And I love those moments, or when I disagree with somebody else about somebody else's craft choice, where I think it does this beautiful thing where, as a writer, when you hear two people disagree over a part, it helps you exercise this muscle of not being precious and not thinking that any one move was actually the clear and key move, right? Like I think I can become very proud of myself with my craft. Like, oh, I did it just so. And the fact that I broke the line there is the reason that the poem is good, like get really reinforced about my own power and influence when it's like, fucking no, like art is a mystery. We don't understand how it works. And part of helping me remember how much of a mystery it is happens when I see two people disagree about a choice I made. It's just really important part of the process for me.
This might sound like a tangent, but I think I can bring these back together. So a lot of what we're talking about has to do with the negative, particularly trauma, exercising trauma, thinking about trauma, and to what extent you can use writing for catharsis, uh, sharing that and having somebody else kind of witness some deep element of that. And I've done a lot of that for sure. But this would be a question for anybody who wants to tangle with it about proof of concept when you read in a group. So this could be for an audience or it could be for a writer's group. If you're talking about trauma, everybody's going to be a little bit more locked up and shy about honest criticism. So it's if they disagree, then you kind of get to see an organic, okay, that's because they're not challenging you, they're talking to each other about what it means. But there's still this tendency, if it's about something very serious, physical illness, for instance. In my case, all of mine is about my dad, who is my favorite person, but who's also like borderline schizophrenic and has some deep-seated mental health issues. My cheat for that, and I don't know how much this is a cheat or if it's legitimate, is humor, because you can do humor in front of an audience of maybe one or more people, and if it's funny, they laugh, and if it's not funny, they don't. And it's the only kind of immediate, like, okay, this thing worked. When I formulated this line in my head, I was hoping we'd get a laugh, and you just hear the audience like, it's like a nervous, obligated, whatever. But when they really laugh, they really laugh. And I think that's one of the reasons we like stand-up comedians so much is they get honed in a way, trial by fire, that might be a little different than a writer's workshop, where there's a little bit more, nobody wants to hurt anybody else's feelings. And so I like writing funny, partly because you get to focus group it with a very literal, it's very serious razor to cut off the fat and sides. But I think it's also a totally fair way to start dealing with trauma. So Vonnegut's another favorite guy. So him talking about the bombing of Dresden, World War II, that's the epicenter of a traumatic young person's experience. But you can clearly see him working through a cathartic experience, but also using humor as, I would argue, a wholesome way to kind of tangle with that. That was more than I meant to say about that. But if anybody wants to chime in, go for it.
I'll jump in. Absolutely agree with you. Humor, I think I use humor in my everyday life to get through a lot of trauma. I hope I can incorporate it more into my poetry because that's who I am. Right now, I think, so two things that you had mentioned. Doing readings when poetry is always intimate, right? It's always very personable. Like, is that, I don't even know if that's the right word, but it's intimate. And poetry about trauma is even more intimate, and about chronic illness, and about, like you had mentioned, mental health, all of these things that are so stigmatized and shamed in society that it's hard to even speak about them, much less write about them in such a vulnerable way. And so one thing that I've struggled with, frankly, as a debut poet, is not knowing if the poetry is good, or if it's not good, or being scared to kind of put it out there in a way where it could get torn to shreds. Not because, I mean, it never feels, rejection never feels good, right? Nobody wants to wake up and be rejected. But I think what makes it difficult with poetry, especially poetry, when it comes to trauma, mental illness, chronic illness, all of these things that show a lot of frailty and weakness, is that when that's torn down, it's such a fragile part of who we are already that it makes it even more difficult to kind of grapple with, instead of just okay, well, this poem maybe wasn't the right, their taste or right for the literary publication, whatever the case may be. But having that kind of extra kind of stab of, wow, okay, not only did the poem suck, but it was about my mother who has OCD and whatever the case may be, and I'm being frivolous, obviously, but there is some truth to that. So I think that's kind of what took me into why I just went into wanting to do a collection for, I submitted to a few publications, but I found that I had a collection and it was cohesive and I had written it kind of in a short period of time. And I've never been one to kind of, I don't know, follow traditional paths anyway in my life. And I felt like I don't really care, of course I care, but at the same time, I really don't care. And I just want it out in the world because I know what I've written is true to me. And however someone perceives it or deems it good or bad or whatever value they give to it doesn't really matter, because the value I give to it is that I wrote what really happened, and that's the highest value. So, but yeah, I agree. It's tough. It's really tough.
Mm. 3 days ago, I got my first paid acceptance on a poem that was rejected 52 times. And so it's like, I think also just taking a moment to be there to remember that there are so many people making art and trying to make art. And this is like, we're trying to survive under capitalism. Art doesn't make money. It's such a saturated environment that, to me, I enjoy those exercises. I actually celebrate and tweet my number of rejections every so often. Like I hit the 1,000 rejections a few months ago, and that was a big deal. And of course, along with that, I am much more published, than I was 2 years ago. And yeah, I think that did require, but anyway, I understand this dance around rejection, and it's really tricky. And I think that there's data out there to help us remember that it's not personal, even though it's really hard to remember that. So I find myself trying to exercise looking for that. And to your point, Chris, about humor, I just wanted to say, sometimes I'm able to be funny, rarely, mostly to myself, but every so often that occurs. One thing that I am very curious about is, when is the function of humor to dispel and guard ourselves as writers, versus when is it like a component that we're adding to a piece that actually brings all of the aspects of life in. I get very interested when I'm both laughing and I'm crying. That's when I feel the most sort of alive. And the last thing I wanted to say comes from a stem that Aaron, you mentioned, which was about whether you're speaking it out loud or not. Just this weekend, with this collection of poets, it's mostly people who write for the written page, but there were a few of us who do slam. And in slam circuits, especially in the slam circuit that we're part of, there's this sort of confessional safe space aspect where people who don't feel able to tell their story anywhere else come to this space in order to share. which completely changes the dynamic from, say, this last weekend where like the purpose was to workshop. And so I think another thing that feels really important to me anytime engaging with my own art or with somebody else's art is to ask, what are you looking for? Are you looking to just be heard, or are you looking for reactions from a craft perspective and being as willing to give whichever the other person wants, and to try to test for myself which I really want? Because sometimes I think I'm ready to get craft, but I'm not actually. I just need to be seen. And so trying to develop that discernment for myself is always a really important part of being a human writing poetry.
Let's see if I can make a short move from your point about rejection first, because that's a key one that I think is super universal or close to universal, and then back to possible tactics for using humor. In terms of rejection, I love that concept. You hear this so often. Stephen King had a little like board where he like put all the rejections that he got and he stuck a pin through it, and then gradually the pin got larger and larger. And so he had to stack up 142 rejections, and then Carrie got published or whatever. In my own life, I've been not taking enough chances. And the way because I'm me, have to functionally deal with this is I haven't been taking a lot of creative chances, and I have not gotten back on the horse in terms of dating. And even with something like dating, it's like, all right, listen, you should probably go out and talk to some girls and start stacking up a jar of rejections and figure, all right, we got to put a number of rejections in the jar, and then assume once the jar gets this full, then all right, good. So you got to think of that as those are wins because you're filling the jar or adding to the little nail, or maybe creating this sense of it's good to take chances. Rejection is evidence that you're putting yourself out there. So trying to connect that back to humor, you can totally use humor as an insecure coping mechanism. Oh, thank God I got the laugh, so I have value, right? And you're still kind of dealing with the same kind of insecurity. But that's at the social level. You said something like, sometimes I think I'm funny to myself. I think that's totally valid. Like if you tell yourself a joke that you think is funny, I think that's 100% valid and could be helpful. So I've done things like when I was, I think, 17, my dad threatened me with a loaded weapon, a loaded gun. Don't tell anybody because it's technically a felony. And I was able, within 3 days, to be like, this is kind of ridiculous. This is actually kind of funny. And I was able to formulate it because I knew nothing serious would happen ultimately, but I'm still sitting on all of this trauma that I'm accumulating so that he can do something like, well, I think you should get a pug instead of a Boston Terrier. And that will still like be equally threatening to something seemingly physical and high stakes. Making fun of it sometimes can literally disarm it, even if it's just inside your own head. Then if that gets into the writing, you can kind of figure out what's the absurdity here? Where are we able to figure out this is just ridiculous? It might be horrible and traumatic, and it's also ridiculous. And maybe, teasing out that ridiculousness. The Daily Show figured that out 20 years ago. They think there's value in that also. It's also why I like Hunter S. Thompson. I think he's a master of that sweet spot.
Agreed.
Wow. We're going to press pause on this conversation, but before we do, Chris, you got to show up in your T-shirt.
So I'm teaching a writing for the STEM field class this semester. So it's like, yep, science matters. Science literacy is a thing, and facts are real. The Earth is round. I don't care what you say. Your opinion doesn't matter in this class. Save that for my poetry class. That's where everybody's opinion is valid. But yeah, since I'm teaching a STEM class, I'm like, all right, represent.
Yeah, and the other thing
to be a science teacher, Morgan, which is what they're referring to.
Yeah.
And now working on age advocacy with young people, so it's also kind of similar.
And then, Chris, you're getting dangerously close to our other podcast, which is on dating. So if you enjoy that tangent, we'll start that up soon. JK.
Yep.
JK.
Absolutely. I feel like we do a call-in show. Use my bad experiences to help other people make.
So I got some text. Do you want to read some text to share? But yeah, so we'll press pause on this. We'll say goodbye for now. Don't go anywhere though. So yeah, great Eben, great Morgan. Thank you again, Chris. we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you guys. Love it.
Thank you.